Hello, my name is Tammy Heiss, and I'm here with Kat Alexandrova, who is this year's senior nominee to the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend competition. Each year, the Wyoming Humanities Research Institute, on behalf of the University of Wyoming, nominates candidates for the NEH competition. Winning one of these grants allows a researcher dedicated time during the summer to focus on their projects. I'm so excited to be here with Kat today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Hi.
Hi, Kat, can you please describe your project for us?
Okay, yeah. Well, so the most basic way of describing it is it's about suicide in the 18th century novel. And just to expand on that a little bit, so of course, as we know, one of the most important historical periods, the Enlightenment, happens during part of the 18th century in France. And so there's a lot of Enlightenment philosophy and also historians who have worked on the topic of suicide, and they've studied this, the way the philosophers were writing about it at that time, also just the way historically this was developing, because in the 18th century, suicide becomes less about like, oh, this person was possessed by demons, like it might have been in the Middle Ages, and more about people starting to understand mental health and even depression, even though they didn't use those terms. And making suicide something secular and medicalized. And so people have studied this period, but people have never really studied the novel, and how the novel describes suicide. And I think it's a really interesting medium to study because, the novel, it shows interiority, it shows emotions. So if you're going to study a phenomenon that's linked to mental and emotional phenomena, of course, the novel is really interesting. And then secondly, a lot of 18th century novels were written by women, and women were actually kind of almost the dominant, I would say maybe the dominant gender in that genre in the Ancien Regime France. And so it's also interesting because women couldn't necessarily be a philosopher and enter philosophical discourse, but they could write novels and explore these ideas and even explore philosophical ideas via the novel form. So that's basically what my project studies.
That's really fascinating. Can you tell us how you became interested in this particular project?
Well, so I originally started studying it back when I was completing my dissertation, which was now a long, long time ago. But I noticed that, the Enlightenment is supposed to be this time that kind of discovers happiness and individual fulfillment and all these things that people didn't really apparently didn't know about before, like love marriage and the fact that you should appreciate having children and actually value children and not just treat them like miniature adults. So all these really interesting social developments happened during that time. But then I was reading the novels and I'm like, okay, well, this doesn't really seem like love marriage is working for these people because they're all kind of committing suicide here after concluding a love marriage, and I was thinking, okay, parenthood doesn't really seem idyllic as you might think it is when you look at 18th century paintings of kind of parents drooling over their baby. And so I just started thinking, okay, so all these like very positive social phenomena that are happening at that time, supposedly, according to historical sources. This doesn't seem to be portrayed in a positive way in the novels. If anything, it's kind of ambiguous. And so I noticed that a lot of these phenomena were actually linked to suicide. So, happiness, for one thing. You would think that if a century has discovered happiness and is writing like treatises about how to become happier, what do you do for perfect happiness? And there's all these suggestions being made by these different authors. You know, and then you actually see that the pressure to be happy is leading these characters to commit suicide in certain novels. So I just thought it was a really interesting paradox, so to speak. And that's how I became interested in the topic. And I decided to explore it a bit more.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, can you describe what the scope is for this particular work?
Well, I think it's you can kind of tell by some of the topics that I've already brought up, like some of these social changes that seem to be linked to suicide in the novel, that it's actually a very broad scope. because you might think like, oh, suicide, that has to be like a very marginal phenomenon. That can't be very, broad. But actually, it's touching on almost every kind of important concept or social change that is happening at that time. So whether you study, let's say, changes in marital law and matrimony, whether you study the new attitudes towards childhood, whether you study this development of the idea of the importance of personal happiness and fulfillment, whether you even study things like cosmopolitanism and travel and moral relativism, suicide will actually kind of come in to all those areas. So, I'm limiting it to a book, but I think, this touches almost every aspect of 18th century life, I would say.
So there's really no limit. But if you had to pick the most interesting thing or important thing that you found so far, what would it be?
So, I was thinking about this question and I realized that it's not one specific thing per se. What I think has really surprised me since I've started working with this material is how much it's relevant to our life right now. Um, and it's not just about, because when we think about the 18th century, of course, we think about all of these huge foundational concepts, right? Like modern democracy, the system of checks and balances, right? As at that time it's being written about by Montesquieu, separation of church and state, major changes in, law. I mean, our revolution, the French Revolution, right? So we think about how those have shaped modern society, but I'm not even talking about something so big. I'm talking about like concepts that are pretty small, even something like breastfeeding, right? So if you look at current, as a kind of recent parent, if you look at Facebook groups or kind of these like mommy wars or who is the best mom or what's the best way to raise kids, you'll see a lot of arguments, for instance, about formula versus breastfeeding. Well, if you look at that literature at that time, well, we're already seeing breastfeeding is becoming big at that time. And for instance, in one of the novels, the character is actually trying to figure out, should I nurse my child or not? And of course, at that time, there's no formula. There is a kind of crude formula, but it's, should I nurse my child or hire out a wet nurse, right? So people are already like being sensitive to issues like postpartum depression. They're not using those words. They're being sensitive to issues of parenting that are really relevant to us right now. And I think that's what really, really struck me. And I remember particularly being struck by, there's this one diarist at the time who basically, so he's a bookstore owner in the Latin Quarter. And he has also, I think it's his wife's brother who is in the police. So he hears a lot about what's actually going on with like real suicide at the time. And he often notes stuff about suicides. And it's almost like, it's very interesting because it's almost a commentary on everyday happenings that are happening in Paris at that time in the 18th century from someone who's kind of in the thick of it, and so often he'll write about suicide and just the things that he points out about some of the victims are incredibly sensitive. Like he writes about this one woman who committed suicide, and he mentioned something about her losing a child recently, and even though it's been like a couple years, she hasn't really gotten over it, and he even is mentioning like breastfeeding. So just, it's very to me, that was really surprising. I wouldn't have expected this almost like modern today's sensibility when we're talking about these issues. So I think that to me was one of the most interesting things.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating. It surprises me a little bit to have a man talking about breastfeeding during that time, since so
Mhm.
often women's issues were sort of off limits.
Right, absolutely. And that's how we think about it too. We don't think that men really noticed or were concerned about these issues.
But what a great insight into the time that confounds some of the things that other historical analysis have pointed out, which leads me to my other question. We've already talked a little bit about why this project is so important, and living in Wyoming with such a high suicide rate, I also see some connections there why people might be interested in this particular topic in this particular place. But could you talk a little bit more about why your project is so important?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, and I'm glad you brought up the Wyoming connection because that's really interesting too. I mean, historians who have studied the 18th century, they've actually they've seen a sharp rise in suicides after firearms become more widely available, which of course is kind of the case sometimes in Wyoming that firearms are a bit too widely available, right? So that's a connection that already exists there in the 18th century. But I think in the novels we see more of perhaps the emotional and interior factors that are leading to this. And maybe we even see how people are kind of picking up on these signs, but not quite knowing what to do or not quite knowing how to address it. And I think that's also a really interesting connection that, just the sensitivity to that topic and just studying it and realizing how complex it is emotionally. And of course, it's not going to translate one for one into our modern setting, but I think just being more sensitive to it is already a really interesting start. And also realizing that, you know, suicide isn't necessarily just about someone being really unhappy, right? If that were true, it would be kind of a pretty easy, maybe, well, not easy, but it would be more preventable perhaps than it is. But it's actually about how certain pressures can make you unhappy, can lead to suicide. And you see that in the novels. And I think today also with social media, we see how kind of the pressure to have this perfect life is actually counterproductive. And it's not just Wyoming. I think the pandemic has shown us too how people are isolated and how suicide rates have actually fallen a little bit following the pandemic, but they're rising in young people. And I think that this is what we kind of have to pay attention to. And I think just being more emotionally aware and sensitive and just realizing how complex these causes are, is already kind of makes this topic really, really relevant to everything that's going on right now.
Yeah, absolutely relevant. Since we've talked about reading already, I wonder what you're reading now and what books you would recommend to our viewers before we conclude our interview.
Yeah. So, well, I tend to read a lot and I tend to read a lot of kind of different things at the same time. It's a little bit of a mishmash. I remember when I was a kid, I would pull off like 6 books off the bookshelf and my dad would just be like, look, you can't be reading all of this at the same time. So just take one and put the rest back, but I tend to be now with like the Kindle and all this modern technology, you can just kind of read so many things. And I tend to read like history and philosophy, and I like writing about religion too, and just very lowbrow stuff like People Magazine, but so currently I'm actually reading, so I'll suggest to our viewers perhaps 2 novels that might help them kind of discover this phenomenon a little bit in the 18th century. And then what I'm reading actually right now, because most of my sources, sadly, I can't really suggest to the viewers because they haven't been translated or they are also not easily accessible, right? Because they're in specialized libraries. And I actually hope to change some of that by working on this topic. I'm hoping to make some of this stuff more widely accessible to readers because I think it's really worth reading more and studying. It's just enjoyable writing besides being interesting. Um, but yeah, so what I'm reading myself right now, I'm actually reading a novel called An Artist of the Floating World, and I was drawn to it just by the title. So it's I'm looking at the author because I'm really bad with like authors' names, but it's Kazuo Ishiguro, and it's basically set after World War II, and he's kind of reminiscing about Japan, how it was before the war, and also his role, and could he have done something differently? So it's really interesting. It's all these things like nostalgia and introspection that I really enjoy in written material. So that's kind of the novel that I'm enjoying right now. But to get back to that 18th century topic, I would suggest 2 novels. So one is Rousseau, and the title is Julie, or the New Eloise. So that novel is pretty long, but if you want to basically get an overview of most of the things that are going on in the Enlightenment, and kind of it starts out as a love story, so it's fairly enjoyable, and then there's you know a marriage more of convenience, and then this utopian society that they're building. And so I think it's really interesting just to see like what were what were people at the time concerned with? How does that translate to what we believe? What did they believe the ideal marital relationship to be? And then, if everyone is so perfectly happy, then why does everyone die at the end of the novel, right? Um, so that would be one recommendation. But if you don't want to get into something that is long and perhaps complex, I would suggest reading. So this is by a woman author. Her name is Isabelle de Charrière, and she was actually Dutch. So I think her Dutch name is Belle de Zuylen. And so Isabelle de Charrière is more her francophone name, but yeah, she lived in Switzerland and she wrote in French. And so this is very short. It's been translated into English, and it's called Letters of Mistress Henley. And so it's about basically it's answering a very popular novel at the time that was called The Sentimental Husband, about this husband who is very sensitive and his wife pushes him to suicide. And so this is answering it from the point of view of the wife, basically. And she says, well, even with a perfect husband, life is not going to be very easy. And so it's a really fantastic novel, in the sense that you can get into all these topics that I've been bringing up in a very condensed way. So, for instance, there's just a really excellent moment when she's pregnant and she's trying to decide if she wants to breastfeed her child. And she talks about it with her husband, and he says, well, you're very emotional. You might pass that down in your milk. We will have to discuss this with the doctor, and the doctor will decide. And then she says, okay, that's it. Like, kind of all of my joy is gone. We're just talking about this baby who's not even born, and he's apparently more important than I am. And you can see even from this kind of short encapsulation how relevant this is to so many topics that we're discussing right now. And so the heroine at the end does not commit suicide. There's a suggestion of it, but it's a really good way to get into the topic. And it's, like I said, it's short and it's very digestible and easily found, like on Amazon even. So.
Well, I can't wait to check out those recommendations. Thank you so much, Kat, for speaking with me. And I'm so thrilled to see how your project progresses. And thank you all for watching. If you're interested in seeing some of the Institute's other lectures and interviews, please check out our YouTube channel and podcast. Feel free to get more information about our organization or join our mailing list at www.uyo.edu/humanities. We always appreciate it when you like, comment, or subscribe. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tammy.